"This house will be inherited by my son," my mother-in-law Maria declared with a grin at my mother's funeral. "I wonder if I should choose this one," she mused, glancing around and contemplating which room to take. "Actually, I'm the one inheriting this house," I corrected her politely. "I know," she retorted without hesitation. "But isn't it true that a wife's belongings belong to her husband? So, in essence, this house belongs to my son, right?" I sighed, questioning the validity of her claim. "From now on, let's get along," she added cheerfully. "What do you mean by get along?" I asked, hesitating. "Turning this room into my room," my mother-in-law declared firmly. "Does that mean we'll be living together?" I inquired. "Exactly," she replied confidently. "With such a splendid house, it'd be a waste to leave rooms empty when two people can live here, don't you think?" Despite my recent loss, my mother-in-law seemed blissfully unaware of my grief. Why would she bring this up now? Couldn't she see the sadness on my face? This is no time for jokes. This house holds precious memories, built by my respected father and cherished by my late mother. I don't want my unreasonable mother-in-law to live here, and my husband, who does nothing to stop her, is equally at fault. To protect my precious home from being tainted, I decided to take the initiative before moving out. My name is Riley, and I'm a 42-year-old office worker. After missing the right time for marriage and remaining single into my 40s, I had given up on the idea of getting married. However, through an acquaintance's introduction, I met Gideon, who is 4 years younger than me, and we were able to get married. My husband is a kind person who prioritizes my opinions. "Where should we go for our honeymoon? You mentioned that Europe would be nice, right?" I asked. "But didn't you say you preferred the Maldives?" "Let's go to the Maldives," my husband replied. "My mom wants to live with us. My dad's health isn't great, and it seems my mom is finding it challenging to manage alone," he explained. "I understand that your mom is going through a tough time, but didn't we agree not to live together before we got married?" I questioned. "You're right. I'll talk to my mom about it." My husband always listens to my whims, and I often feel guilty about it. Meeting a good person is a joy, but there's one regret. My father passed away 3 years before I got married, so I couldn't show him my wedding and reassure him. My father was a strict executive at a small and medium enterprise, and I deeply respected him. Despite the modest size of the company, his income was decent, and our family home was sizable enough to hold a funeral. As I began working as an office employee, I gained a deeper understanding of the challenges of work, which only increased my admiration for my father. Then, 2 years after our marriage, my mother also passed away. Funerals are generally less commonly held at home, but my mother's funeral was conducted at home. "Are you okay? Shouldn't you take a break in the back room?" my husband asked. During my mother's funeral, he always looked out for me. Truly, I was fortunate to have met such a good husband. That's when my mother-in-law arrived. "My deepest condolences. I sincerely sympathize with you," Maria said. "Thank you," I replied. I hadn't lived together with my mother-in-law, and our interactions had been limited, maintaining a reasonable distance. However, it was during my mother's funeral that I glimpsed her true nature. Following the funeral, my mother-in-law approached me. While it was not uncommon for her to seek me out, her expression carried an oddly gleeful tone. "You must be relieved that everything went as planned. It's always a challenge to manage these things, but we handled it well, didn't we?" she remarked with an unsettling smile. Then, abruptly, Maria added, "The funeral is over now. Isn't it enough with the formalities?" I was taken aback, thinking she was initially trying to be considerate of my grief. But it soon became evident that wasn't the case. Commenting on the splendid house my parents had, she continued, "Wait a moment." Undeterred, she boldly walked into the depths of the house. I protested, "Oh, Mom, this is inconvenient. Some areas are messy." Dismissing my concerns, she declared, "Don't fuss over details. More importantly, this house will be inherited by my son. I wonder if I should take this room." Hesitating, I tried to clarify. "Mom, I'm the one inheriting this house." Smirking, she responded, "I know your parents didn't have any other children, right? And isn't a wife's belongings her husband's? So, in essence, this house belongs to my son, doesn't it?" I sighed, questioning the validity of her claim. Cheerfully, she added, "From now on, let's get along." My hesitation prompted her to confidently declare, "I mean turning this room into my room." Concerned, I asked, "Does that mean we'll be living together?" Without hesitation, she replied, "Exactly. I've decided with such a splendid house, it'd be a waste to have empty rooms when yet 2 more people can live here. Finally, I won't have to take care of my husband all by myself." Even though my mother had recently passed away, my mother-in-law was making such statements. I became increasingly angered, wondering why she would joke around at a time like this. As my conversation with my mother-in-law began to escalate, my husband stepped in. "Mom, what are you doing? This is not the time for this," he said sharply. Unbothered, my mother-in-law shot back, "Why are you overreacting?" My husband didn't back down. "That's enough. You need to go," he continued firmly, guiding her toward the door. After she left, he turned to me with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry. My mom can be a bit much sometimes." Relieved by his support, I replied, "It's okay. Thank you for stepping in." Over the following days, I began to understand that my husband's approach to addressing my mother-in-law's behavior was quietly, but distinctly, different from mine. 10 days after my mother's funeral, as life began to settle a little, we decided it was time to discuss the future of my family home. "This apartment feels so cramped. Don't you think we should move into my parents' house?" I suggested. He nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're right. With all our stuff and the possibility of kids in the future, it makes more sense than staying in this tiny apartment." Then, as he glanced around the small apartment, he added, "It does make sense. We've been talking about needing more space for a while now." I nodded, but something about the move felt off to me. "Are you sure there's nothing else you want to say?" I asked, sensing his hesitation. He hesitated for a moment before finally saying, "Since the house is so spacious with all those empty rooms, I was thinking, maybe my parents could move in with us." Stunned, I questioned, "Are you suggesting we live together?" Recently, I've noticed a change in my husband. Despite thinking he prioritized my opinions, I now wonder if he's merely a yes man, or even a pushover. His compliance with my mother-in-law's requests and his suggestion of living together make me question his true stance. Despite my repeated objections to cohabitation, he persists, seemingly prioritizing her over me. "Haven't I told you repeatedly? We are not living together," I reminded him. "But Mom keeps insisting," he replied. "At the funeral, you scolded her, didn't you?" "You stood up for me and said no to living together," I countered. "Yes, I was upset about her barging into the house, but that doesn't mean I'm completely against living together. I just felt that such an important decision shouldn't be made so casually in that situation," Gideon admitted. It was decisive. Despite nodding in agreement with my stance, he seems more inclined towards my mother-in-law. Moreover, he avoids making definitive decisions, maintaining a certain distance, perhaps unconsciously believing he remains neutral. People like him can be tricky, convincing themselves of their neutrality and decision-making abilities. It's frustrating. I oppose living with someone who barged into my parents' house on the day of the funeral and suggested living in a particular room. I won't change my stance. Please convey this to your mom, I concluded firmly. "Why?" he asked in surprise, then added, "You seem really bothered by this. Fine, I'll let her know." While I had mentally prepared for the possibility of living with my in-laws when we got married, witnessing my mother-in-law's behavior during my mother's funeral changed my perspective. Living together in the cherished home my father built is now unthinkable, especially considering my husband's lack of assertiveness. When he conveyed my opposition to cohabitation, my mother-in-law directly protested by calling me. "Why are you opposing cohabitation when there's such a spacious house? You're Gideon's wife now, and his father and I are your parents, right? Why such strong opposition to living together with us?" she demanded. I reiterated, I decline cohabitation, explaining my husband's mobility issues and the challenges I face alone. "You're abandoning us," she accused. "These are the reasons my husband shared with you," I reminded her. Despite feeling sorry for my father-in-law's health, I can't ignore the possibility of everything related to him being pushed onto me if we were to live together. If we consider cohabitation, a significant improvement in my husband and mother-in-law's mindset is a non-negotiable requirement, I added. A few days after my mother-in-law labeled me heartless, my husband surprised me by rearranging the living room, moving furniture around to create space. "What are you doing? Is this for storing moving boxes?" I asked. "No, I'm planning to make space for 2 beds here," he responded. The mention of 2 beds filled me with dread. Cautiously, I asked, "Are your parents coming to stay?" To my dismay, he replied, "No, they're moving in today," even before the actual move. The realization hit me. Despite my objections, my husband and mother-in-law were forcing cohabitation upon me. "Why is this happening?" I questioned, feeling a growing sense of frustration. "Their lease is up, so we decided they'd move here without renewing it. It'll be cramped for 4 people, but we're moving soon, right? Just bear with it for a little while," he explained. "That's not what I meant. Why are we even considering cohabitation? I've said it before. I don't want to live with someone who barged into my parents' house on the day of the funeral and claimed this room," I repeated, my distress evident. "I'll make sure to talk to Mom," he responded. "We'll be living together from now on, so please get along." Annoyed, I questioned, "Why do you prioritize everything your mom says?" "It's not about prioritizing her. I listened to both of your opinions and made a judgment," Gideon clarified. However, my husband, often a yes man, seemed to have fallen for her cohabitation strategy. Unwittingly swayed by her, he believed he was making independent judgments. I used to see him as kind, but when paired with my mother-in-law, he became a handful, forcing me into cohabitation with my in-laws. As we welcomed my in-laws into our cramped apartment, my mother-in-law began complaining about the living conditions. I apologized for the sudden arrival of 2 elderly people and assured them we would manage until the move. However, my father-in-law, Eugene, seemed polite, and it appeared he wouldn't be problematic, but subtle signs indicated he was following my mother-in-law's lead, becoming another yes man. Days later, my mother-in-law requested an errand to buy a medicated patch. Frustrated, I wondered why she made decisions without involving me in the conversation. Minor as it was, it raised concerns about potential future impositions. Living together seemed unsustainable. With my in-laws preparing for their move to my parents' home, I decided to take preemptive action. As my mother-in-law expressed excitement about moving to the spacious house, I initiated behind-the-scenes preparations, determined to protect my parents' home. After about 10 uneventful days, I revealed my decision to renounce my inheritance. Handing over the official court approval, I explained, "That house holds immense sentimental value. I couldn't bear the thought of you living there, so I decided to let go of the house, preserving it as a beautiful memory in my heart." My mother-in-law scolded, "What madness possessed you? Even if you were letting it go, you could have sold it for money." "Why abandon the house?" I calmly explained, "Even if I sold it, you'd just rely on that money. Next, I thought it'd be clearer if I simply had nothing. We moved out of our previous place for this move, you know." "What are you doing? How will you make it up to us?" she retorted. "I've consistently opposed cohabitation, yet without proper discussion, you forced it upon me. So I took a firm stance," I concluded. Both my husband and mother-in-law seemed stunned upon learning about my renunciation of inheritance. Their faces drained of color, and they were left speechless, their strength sapped. My father-in-law looked bewildered as he observed the 2 of them. However, I wasn't about to let up. "Gideon," I continued, "I've been thinking about getting a divorce. What do you think?" Hearing my words, my husband started to stammer. "Huh? Divorce?" "Gideon, you should divorce this ridiculous wife immediately," my mother-in-law chimed in. I had expected her immediate demand for divorce, wanting to confirm whether my husband could make an independent decision at this critical moment. "Mom," my husband mumbled. His response was still pending, but my resolve to proceed with the divorce had solidified. "Fine, divorce is the only option," my mother-in-law snapped. My father-in-law interjected, "Gideon, it can't be helped. Your mom insists." "Well, you seem to want a divorce too, and maybe that's for the best," my husband said, with a sigh. "Even in significant decisions, My husband and father-in-law remained yes men to my mother-in-law. And now my husband's words made it sound as if he changed his opinion for my sake. Very well, I declared. Let's proceed with the divorce. I'll be moving out with minimal belongings. I spent the night at a budget hotel. Urgent matters awaited the next day, so I took half a day off work and headed back to the courthouse. A few days later, my mother-in-law called me demanding an answer. Hey, what's going on? It seems like that house is becoming yours, she exclaimed. Why the sudden outburst? I asked. Did you find out through the estate division process? Yes, that house belongs to me. You forged documents and deceived us, she continued angrily. I calmly refuted. Why would I forge documents meant for court submission? Those are genuine. Then why is the house becoming yours when you were supposed to renounce the inheritance? My mother-in-law insisted. Well, right after that, I promptly withdrew the application. Renouncing an inheritance is difficult once accepted. However, it takes about a month for the renunciation application to be accepted, during which time it can be withdrawn at any point, I explained. The documents I showed my in-laws were not acceptance-related. They were from the application stage. I intentionally made them believe I had relinquished the house and confronted them with the prospect of divorce to gauge their reactions and decide my next steps. I didn't expect my mother-in-law's mindset to change, but I hoped my husband would reconsider and express that he didn't want a divorce. If he said he didn't want a divorce, I planned to rethink it and later explain about the house. However, she continued, so the house really becomes yours then. Since it was acquired before the divorce, it's subject to property division, right? In that case, you two are supposed to split the money from selling it, aren't you? My mother-in-law seemed determined to extract whatever she could, realizing the house wouldn't be hers. But I had anticipated this. If the house were jointly acquired, it would indeed be considered shared property. However, this is a unique asset acquired through inheritance, and as such, it's exempt from property division. Assets like this, fortunately, aren't eligible for division, I explained firmly. What about the money that would come to Gideon through property division? She asked. We've only been married for a few years, so there's hardly anything substantial. Maybe just the car, although there's still an outstanding loan on it, I calmly responded. Accusing me of selfishness, she called me heartless. I'm protecting that house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I don't want people like you living there, I retorted to her accusations. If you have any further complaints, please go through a lawyer, I added. After the call with my mother-in-law, the divorce proceedings progressed smoothly. Presumably, she urged my husband to expedite the divorce. Regardless, the divorce was finalized, and I was free from the burden of dealing with my in-laws. I felt a wave of relief, as though I had successfully safeguarded my father's home from harm. After I moved out, my former in-laws moved into the apartment where my ex-husband and I once lived. Despite having one fewer person, the cramped space probably didn't feel much more comfortable. My former mother-in-law started searching for new housing, but their age made it difficult to pass rental screenings. Eventually, my ex-husband rented a smaller single-family home for them. While it's a house, it's likely more expensive than the apartment. He also took on the responsibility of supporting his parents financially. My ex-husband now faces a tough road ahead. Once thrilled at the prospect of living in the spacious home my father left behind, my former mother-in-law now has to settle for a much smaller place. A disappointing outcome, no doubt. As for me, I've started a new chapter in the home my parents left me. It feels warm and full of life, as though my parents' presence still lingers here.